welcome to this discussion today. My name is Djene Bajalan. I'm an assistant professor of history at Missouri State University, and I'm very pleased and honored to be here with you today, talking with Professor Abbas Vali about his new book on Kurdish nationalism in Iran between the fall of the Mahabad Republic and the outbreak of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. The book is entitled The Forgotten Years of Kurdish Nationalism in Iran, and it is published by Palgrave Macmillan. And I've had the good fortune to have read a copy of it, and it's an extremely important contribution to the literature on the origins and development of Kurdish nationalism. So let me just make a few announcements before we begin our discussion and before I hand over to Professor Abbas Vali. So, many of you, of course, know Professor Vali because he's one of the leading figures in our field, has written, pioneering studies on Kurdish nationalism in Iran, including an earlier volume, which I would say is probably kind of the first part of this broader history that he's been engaging with on Iran, Kurdish nationalism in Iran, Kurds in the state in Iran, the making of the Kurdish identity, which was published in 2011. And we have the Kurdish question in Iran, 2012. And then, of course, he has several other important contributions: Pre-Capitalist Iran, essays on the origins of Kurdish nationalism, and numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals, which of course is sort of par the course for our profession. Professor Vali was born in 1949 in Mahabad, Iran. He received his secondary education in Tabriz, obtained a BA in political science from National University in Iran, which today is, I believe, Shahid Beheshti University. He then moved to the United Kingdom, where he sort of obtained his MA and then his PhD in sociology. He taught for years in Swansea in Wales, and after which he moved to Iraqi Kurdistan, where he was the founding rector of the University of Kurdistan, Hawliya, after which he then later went to teach in Turkey at Boğaziçi University. And I know from my years in Turkey that he was a very important figure to all the students, especially Kurdish students in Turkey, who are very pleased to see have a leading Kurdish academic at their institution. And Professor Abbas Vali is really a fixture and a kind of doyen of Kurdish history, politics, and approaching it from a very theoretically sophisticated angle. Now, I would like to also say a few words about the sponsor of this this presentation today, the Center for Kurdish Progress. The Center for Kurdish Progress is a non-profit organization based in London. It has an independent and non-partisan organization inaugurated in June 2014. It provides expert opinions and debates focusing on the issue of Kurdistan and the Kurdish people in the UK, as well as internationally. It is as a policy forum, Kurdish Progress organizes speaker series, panels, discussions, and social events in order to progress the position of the Kurdish people in the United Kingdom and to offer space for debating Kurdistan's position in the world. Collaboration with the British Parliament, local and international think tanks, and academic institutions frames the core principles of its action. So with those announcements aside, I would like to sort of introduce Professor Vali, who will be talking for a little bit, after which I believe we'll have between 20 and 30 minutes of Professor Vali presenting some of the main ideas in his book, after which we will open the floor to discussion, to questions, and I hope we will be able to have like a robust discussion and questions. Please enter your questions in the chat. And I will read those questions out, and I'll take them one at a time so that we can sort of focus on one question at a time. So I will try to get to as many questions as possible. So please, Professor Vali, please tell us about your new contribution to the literature.
Thank you very much, Djene, for the introduction. Before I proceed, I would like to thank the sponsor, the Center for Kurdish Progress, and also I would like to thank Dr. Cengiz Güneş for inviting me and making this event possible. I'm grateful to him and also to Djene for agreeing to act as moderator and also discussant of this session. The book we are talking about is a sequel to a first book, which, as Djene said, was published in 2011 and it has been reprinted, I believe, 3 or 4 times. And this one published in 2017 and has gone to a second print by now. And it is, in a sense, sequel to the first one. Both of them are part of a larger project, which I have variously referred to it as the trilogy of Kurdish nationalism in Rojhelat, or Eastern Kurdistan, Iranian Kurdistan otherwise. And this trilogy is clearly 1 and 2 are published and made public, but the third one is being written now. And I am hoping that along with other projects which are in hand, probably I will finish the work in a couple of years, because I'm also at the same time involved in writing another book, which is called Reconstituting the Kurdish Question, which is focusing basically on Rojava and Rojhelat and the problems that these two historical experiences pose for the presentation and articulation of the Kurdish question in discourse and practice, in academia as well as in the wider public of media, journalism, and also political activism, and so on and so forth. The book, which was published in 2019, is entitled The Forgotten Years of present the kind of the necessity of writing this book, the kind of gap or hiatus which was there. Most of the writings on the Iranian in the Kurdish nationalism in Iran, or the Iranian case, so to speak, was either on earlier phase, mostly on the Republic of Kurdistan, which lasted for 11 months, from January 1946 to mid-December 1946, and then it collapsed under the pressure, military and political pressure from the central government. And also there is a significant amount of writing in terms of essays, broadcasts, and sort of particularly, if you like, biographies and autobiographies and so on and so forth, which are dealing with the period of usually after the revolution, but retrospectively. So they are focusing on this period of 1946 to 1979. But as I have indicated in the book as well, in the introduction, there is this gap, these 3 decades of 1947 to 1979 is hardly anything if you like, significant has been written about it. That's why, despite its importance, that's why I call it the forgotten years of Kurdish nationalism in Iran. Very few people actually have, very few people, they have actually sort of specialist knowledge of it. And as I said, the accounts of this period come in two types. Either they are, if you like, biographies, autobiographies of people who played an important role in this period of 1946 to 79, or they were or they were the accounts which are there are written by political parties, proceedings of meetings, or discussion of particular events and developments during these three very important decades. The first one, which are autobiographies, as I have indicated, or biographies, they are intensely subjective. And they have to be, in a sense, by definition, they are biographies and autobiographies. They're centered on the experience of particular subjects, in a sense, and they narrate that experience or narrate the period or particular political process and particular political event from the point of view of that particular subject or a collectivity of subject, if it is a party. And the second one, which is a party, if you like, material, political party materials, are also intensely ideological because they are, in a sense, looking at the events, looking at the three very important decades from the standpoint of specific political parties and their as political actors, and also, if you like, makers of events, participants in the events, and so on and so forth. But their views are, as expected, are, if you like, ideological, by which I mean they represent a particular political stance. And from that particular political stance, they see the event and they define various, if you like, episodes in this three decades, or, before or after that decade. So I tried, in a sense, I have used both of these materials, but I tried to give, if you like, sort of some academic account of, for the first time, try to write about this period. I don't claim to have filled the gap, but at least touched it. I feel like I at least signified the importance of this gap. I tried to explain why it is so important, why there is a dearth of material written research, and it is under-researched, underrepresented, underwritten about, and has to be, in a sense, addressed. This lack, this, if you like, gap, has to be addressed. This was, in a sense, I came as part of the, I came to this as part of my project. And also, I mean, there was no way that I could actually jump from 1946-7 to 1979 and talk about the revolution and after, and the revival of the Kurdish movement in Iran after 1979 up to 1985. And again, it's, if you like, marginalization and the beginning of a new phase, what I call in the book as exilic nationalism, nationalism in exile. So that is basically the time span of the book, and it is important as a period which has been under-researched, underrepresented, under-written about, and so on. All of it is, in a sense, under, they're basically not touched upon, really. It is, in that respect, it is a field very new, very open, and in certain ways it is very, very wanting. is demanding research and so on and so forth. So the book starts with the period, what I call the period of restoration of order in Kurdistan in the aftermath of the collapse of the Kurdish Republic, and period of suppression of, and if you like, suppression and suppression of both freedoms and of also people, and suppression primarily of the nascent Kurdish nationalism in Iran. Why I call it nascent? Because I am one of those who believes that Kurdish nationalism is a fundamentally a modern phenomenon in all parts of Kurdistan, is barely about 130, probably 150 years old. And in Iran, in earnest, it starts really in 1930s and culminating in the Republic of Mahabad in first in the formation of the Komaleji Kurd in 1942, and the Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran in 1945, and then the Republic in 1946. So it was a nascent nationalist movement, really, very inexperienced, but it came about in a very important historical conjuncture in Iran after during the occupation of Iran by the Allied forces in 1941, and which continued until 1946. Of course, Soviets left in May 1946, and the British as well. So these few years were very important opening for Kurdish nationalism there. But the period of restoration was the demise of this. And I tried in chapter 1 and chapter 2 look at this restoration, what happened to this restoration, what the government did in order to revive order and reintroduce the sovereign language, sovereign culture, sovereign identity, and suppress Kurdish identity, culture, language, and so on and so forth, and go back to an order which had been established by Reza Shah in 1935, 36 afterwards. So this is the situation, and the restoration that I'm talking about is also interrupted. What is important is that we are never talking about one line progression in history and politics of the region. It is interrupted by developments in Iranian politics, but primarily by the crisis which is known as the crisis of nationalization of oil in Iran, which subsequently ends in the coup d'etat of August 1953. During this period of 1951 to 1953, we also see again attempts at revival, public revival of Kurdish politics, nationalist politics, but not on a scale which was there before the collapse of the Republic. But during this period, also repression continues, but in a sense, not with the force that it was pursued from 1947 to 1950. So 1953, when the coup d'etat takes place, we come to a new phase, if you like, in the development of Kurdish nationalism in Iranian Kurdistan. And when I'm talking about Iranian Kurdistan as well, or Rojhelat, primarily my focus in the Mukrian region. And the reason is not here I am, pursuing some sort of regionalism, but the reason fundamentally is that because that was, if you like, the locus classicus of Kurdish nationalism, so to speak, Mahabad, Bokan, if you like, and Nagada, Ishnoviya, Sardasht, Saqqas, and so on. Now we see that the center of Kurdish nationalism actually, after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, more generally, but more particularly after in 1990s and now at present, the center of Kurdish nationalism in Iran, or rather say that center of Kurdish radicalism. It doesn't have to be really nationalism only, but Kurdish radicalism in general has shifted from the north, Mokrian, to the Ardalan area, which is basically Sina, Sanandaj, and Marivan, and Pava, and Kermanshah, and that area have become more active, more radical. This shift has to be explained, very important it is, but it has sociological and political reasons, but it is beyond the scope of these studies. But so when I am talking about 1950s, 60s, 70s, and early 80s, and 70s, the focus, the focal point, the center really is southern, is the northern Kurdistan, northern sector of Rosh Halat, northern sector of Iranian Kurdistan, so to speak. And here we see the revival of activity after the political crisis, during the political crisis, the nationalist crisis, so to speak, nationalization of oil. And after that, after coup d'etat, we face an entirely new development. And this new development is very important. And it is in the very, if you like, internal to the very reason that coup d'etat happened in Iran. And that was the inefficiency of the state, and particularly the apparatuses of domination and order that made coup d'etat possible, if and in fact necessary. So shortly after the coup d'etat, we see Iran is on the, going through a very dark times, which is suppression and further suppression and suppression of political parties, in particular communist parties, and also all ethnic organizations or ethnic, if you like, groupings, even not organizations, but there is a lot of focus in their suppression in here. What is here is that from 1953, the coup d'etat happens and the monarchy is reinstated and the Shah is brought back, and then Britain and the United States of America as the makers of the coup d'etat, so to speak. But here I must say that it would be wrong to say that coup d'etat was an entirely foreign making. It wasn't. The bulk of the Iranian military was with the coup d'etat. The bulk of the Iranian mercantile class, or the so-called national bourgeoisie, was with coup d'etat, and almost entire land-owning class in Iran, tribal and non-tribal, Persian, Kurdish, whatever, Azeri, they were behind the coup d'etat. So it was not just really, that Americans and the British came and did the coup and went away. No, coup had the reinstating monarchy had internal support among the classes and forces who had vested interest in the continuation of monarchy in Iran. And they used this fear of communism, fear of left-wing radicalism in Iran to convince the forces which were hesitant or even opposed to coup d'etat to either stay silent or not actively take part in support of Mossadegh's regime. And popular support for Mossadegh was strong, but it was not organized, and it didn't have support of the army. So Mossadegh's government collapsed, and oil, despite being nationalized, again retained to the hands of monarchy and the supporters. and Britain and America signed new oil deals with Iran, and thing continued. But what is very important here is that the coup d'etat showed structural weakness of political power in Iran and had to be, in a sense, reinstated. It had to be restructured, reconstructed. And this reconstruction, restructuring was very important in terms of development of Kurdish nationalism during these three periods, because restructuring and reconstructing the order and the apparatuses and the forces of domination and subordination in Iran at the time, in a sense, led to rationalization of repression. We see that when in 1953, when coup d'etat happens, the major instrument of suppression is a particular organ within the Iranian army. But in 1957, for the first time, we see the creation of a modern secret service in Iran, a modern political police, which came to be known as the notorious SAVAK, the Sazman Ettelaat و Amniyat Keshvar, the Organization for the Information and the Security of the country. SAVAK was established in 1953 with the help of foreign forces. Some would say America and Britain, and some would say also Israelis were quite active in the creation of it, but this is another issue, has to be investigated, and in part has been investigated, but not fully. But the important thing is that when repression was rationalized, this rationalization of repression in Kurdistan had a consequence. And this consequence was the systematic repression of nationalist forces, which forced them systematically to exile. It is the beginning of, if you like, in earnest, the beginning of what I call the exilic nationalism, nationalism in exile, which in a sense, in a big way, the nationalist forces in 1959, after a major SAVAK clampdown, they move to Iraqi Kurdistan. Before that, after the collapse of the republic, there has been an exodus. There had been an exile. They're mostly gone to the Soviet Union and some to the Eastern Bloc and some very small group to Iraqi Kurdistan. But now most of the nationalists who had not been arrested and were in prison, they basically migrated to Iraqi Kurdistan, and the beginning of the nationalists in exile, in nationalism in exile, began after 1959. And the beginning of nationalism in exile was a new development in a sense that it is directly linked with the adaptation of the strategy of armed struggle against the regime in Iran. And this is this articulation of change in the conduct of the nation state in Iran and the rationalization of repression in Iran and the development of new technologies of repression and subjection on the one hand, and the Kurdish reaction to that. I'm calling this reaction because this exile was not a planned thing. It was not a particular strategy to go on exile. It was, if you like, reactive, reactive to the situation. It was fundamentally guided by the drive to preserve and survive. And they went to exile, and this opened the way to the strategy of armed struggle, which in 1964, the KDP of Iran was the first organization in the whole of Iran which adopted the strategy of armed struggle in 1964. It was about 3 years or 4 years before the advent of guerrilla movement in Iran. guerrilla movement came about in around 67, 8, but while the KDP of Iran adopted the strategy of armed struggle in 1964. And this is very important in a sense that for the book, which also theoretically looks at the development of this period of history, right from the beginning, when I said that advent of Kurdish nationalism in Iran, the republic, collapse of republic, the restoration and the revival, attempt to revive movement in Iran in the period of oil crisis. And after that, we have the coup d'etat, and after coup d'etat, rationalization of repression in Iran, and then the advent of exile, nationalism in exile, exilic nationalism. And after that, we have the movement towards the adaptation of armed struggle as a fundamental strategy of Kurdish nationalism against the monarchy. This is the basis which I also use in order to look at the, this period, history of this period genealogically, not in the way that a historicist would look, but genealogically in kind of ascending order of changes in the relationship of domination and suppression, which primarily targets Kurdish identity and then establishes networks of domination over Kurdish community. This development is seen in terms of changes in the relations of domination and subordination in a genealogical manner, in ascending order, unlike the historicist way, which is looking at it descending, going down to roots. This is only looking at the order of working of power, sovereign power, and the Kurdish reaction to that. And this relationship between power, sovereign power, and the Kurdish opposition or Kurdish resistance is articulated in my discussion into a dialectic of suppression and resistance, a dialectic of violence at the nexus of which stands this Kurdish nationalism and its development. I have used this theoretical picture also in order to provide a genealogy of violence in Kurdistan, how this violence should be seen, whether this violence can be attributed to subjective, specific historical actors or political actors, or it should be seen as a process in which multiplicity of actors are participant. And if so, should this violence be attributed also the claims of those who are participant in it, actors, for instance, the Iranian state, which is saying that fighting against separationism, and the Kurdish nationalists who will say that they are fighting against suppression of their identity. So it is violence, counter-violence, or is violence and, if you like, an act of liberation. This is to be seen. I have tried to break sort of out of this, what is called circular argument of means and ends for violence. For instance, government is using violence as a means in order to restore order, maintain order. Kurdish nationalism is using what is called counter-violence, revolutionary violence against the government in order to fight suppression and so on and so forth. What I am trying to do here is to break out of this circular dead end of means and ends and move towards a historical understanding of violence in the context of Kurdish politics in Rojava. And it is, if you like, the last part of the book is dedicated to the analysis of or genealogy of this violence, which, as I say, it goes back to the analysis of the way that exilic nationalism came about, which is a reaction to the, which is a reaction to the rationalization of means of suppression and changes within the apparatuses of the state and the working of power, sovereign power in Iran on the one hand, and also reaction of the Kurdish nationalists to this going to exile. But this development, I have argued, that is filtered through the existing social, economic, and cultural forces and relations in Kurdistan, and primarily goes back to the long predominance of pre-capitalist relations in Kurdistan, which were only dissolved after 1962. And these developments suggest that throughout this period, large part of Iranian Kurdish land-owning class was part of this structure of violence on the side of the state, at least activities of the state. Whatever the state is, filtered through the interests of part of this, if you like, land-owning class and the commercial bourgeoisie in Iran. And when it filtered through, it reached the society as forces of order and maintenance of the situation in which certain actors obviously benefited from that. So this is the, if you like, another objective of the book, which is looking at this genealogy, trying to look at its history in terms of shifting relations, shift in the relations of domination and subordination between Kurdish community and its political actors on the one hand, and the sovereign state in Iran and its apparatuses of repression on the other. The story is carried to 1979, and it is too long. I'm going to stop here, and hopefully we can discuss it in the course of questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Vali, for that excellent sort of summary of the framework of your work. You know, obviously in such a short presentation, it's extremely difficult to, you know, cover the very extensive way that you have detailed this through the, you know, use of a quite diverse set of primary sources, and, you know, really added an important contribution because, of course, as you point out, this is an extremely underdeveloped sort of area of Kurdish studies. We don't have a very clear picture of this this era in history, and on Iranian Kurdistan in general, as we've seen, like an explosion of literature focusing on northern Kurdistan, southern Kurdistan, of course now Rojava, Iranian Kurdistan, Rojava often sort of gets left behind in that study. So, you know, I think this is an extremely important contribution, and you're very humble about this, but this is, at least in the English language, the first sort of work that explicitly focuses on this period in Kurdish history, and, you know, provides important background to what happened in 1979. As you know, sort of our historiographical image of Iranian Kurdistan is basically the Mahabad Republic, and then 1979 and the armed struggle, and we missed this huge, you know, generation and a half period in which, you know, many of the political actors who would come to play an important role in politics in the 80s came of age, and the sort of historical and political context within which they came of age. So I very much appreciate this. Now, I want to open up the talk to questions. So we have a chat. So people should be able to post questions in the chat. So if you have any questions, please please start writing them down. We'll see if I can just make sure that I have them up. Send chat to everybody. Okay. So please, people put, you know, people should be putting them in the chat. So I'll be looking out for them. Okay. So before I start asking about some of the questions from the chat. I'm going to take my prerogative as the convener of the talk to ask some of the questions I had about the piece. So you do go into this in detail in the book, but would it be possible for you to perhaps outline a little bit to the audience the primary reasons that this period between 1946 and 1979 is so poorly understood within the broader context of the history of Kurdish nationalism?
I think the primary reason has been a lack of sources for researchers. You know, we would have found it very difficult, really, to go and look for sources. They have found it very difficult to address issues without having, if you like, a specific project to follow for a long time. But also, I think because it's been, in a sense, unexciting. It doesn't have the exciting sort of, for historians and political scientists, sociologists, it is not the rise and fall of the Republic. It is not the turbulent years of revolutionary rupture in Iran in 1979 and after. And it is a period which more or less is quiet. And if you are not really part of this society, you don't know what was going on in Mahabad, in Bukan, in Sakka Zimbana, or in Sardasht and Nagadashnovi and these parts of, you know, and if you do not know that, then it'd be difficult for you to try to form a proper picture of it and to pursue it. Doesn't have that excitement, doesn't have that clarity, doesn't have that, if you like, definite political actors, doesn't have that part of exciting sort of discourse for analysis in that. That's, I think, that's one reason. And I think also that the period of 1946 to 1979 is, you know, you know, for contemporaries at that time, would have simply been impossible to do that because of the repression in Iran. And those outside Iran, I think probably it is lack of sources and lack of access to people to discuss, or also even lack of imagination to think about this period. I would also say that, really, on the part of scholars and so on. So that is a period which is left largely untouched. And some people, there are people who have with encyclopedic knowledge of this period. And it is very important for researchers really to use this, you know, this opportunity, try to write about aspects of this particular, you know, period in Iranian, in the history of Roshalat, and for that matter, even history of Iran. You know, there was really very, very few, but, you know, opportunities to do so for people who were at the time living in Iran. I grew up during that, you know, sort of, in a sense, the developments in the 60s and the 70s, I witnessed them both as a kind of, as a child and then as a young man. In Iran. And I know, for instance, I have a vivid memories of the advent of armed struggle, you know, what happened, you know, the short-lived armed struggle in Iran, what happened, if you like, to short-lived armed struggle in Kurdistan, sorry, and why it was defeated, and so on and so forth. And also, I remember the waves of, the first wave of repression in 1959, when I was, you know, 9 years old at the time. But I remember people in my family or immediate family or related friends of family and so on, who were pushed and forced to exile. So it was, in a sense, I had the memory of it. And when I started writing this, you know, trilogy, I actually started writing kind of called a book called Modernity and Stateless in Iran, basically focusing on. But then I realized that this is going to be a really very large project. There is no way that I can do justice to this subject by putting all of it in one book and talking about it in a way that I want to. That's why I decided to write these three parts. And they are in many ways interrelated, but they're also are independent books.
So I have a kind of second follow-up to that. It's kind of a question slash comment before I get to the questions in the chat. One of the striking things about the narrative that you provide for us is the shifting nature of state power and the sort of way that state power is exercised during this period. The thoughts that came to my mind when reading that was, comparing it, of course, to the exercise of state power in other parts of Kurdistan and how it might be compared to that. And I think what I found most interesting is that and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is in the early part, at least before, before the 1950 coup and before the White Revolution, the political order in Kurdistan looks very much similar to the order that prevailed in Turkey. In terms of the fact that you had major sections of the feudal elite and the commercial bourgeoisie acting as a kind of comprador for the state and being critical to the strategies of the state to maintain order in that society. And that's a very sort of parallel development to the kind of way that power was exercised in Turkey. In contrast, in the period after that, with at least the pretense of the Shah's regime to the White Revolution, you see the emergence of social conditions much more similar to Iraqi Kurdistan, where you're having a direct, a more contentious relationship with the traditional social classes, the old social classes of Kurdistan that had been so central to the maintenance of order in the region. I'm wondering, sort of this kind of dual nature, how do you think, how does this relate to the way that the Kurdish movement developed and how it compares to Turkey and Iran? Because I've always seen the Iranian Kurdish movement as sort of having sort of aspects of the Kurdish movement in Iraq similar to Iraq, but in some ways more similar to the movement that emerged in Turkey. I wonder what your thoughts on that are.
I think the Kurdish movement in Iran, or Kurdish nationalist politics in Iran, has clearly similarities with the southern Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, and also certain similarities with northern Kurdistan or Turkey. But on the whole, I think differences and dissimilarities are more than similarities. For instance, in one fundamental difference with Iraqi Kurdistan is that in Eastern Kurdistan, in Rojhelat, in Iranian Kurdistan, the leadership of Kurdish movement has always been urban, has always been with the urban classes, fundamentally what is called the petty bourgeoisie or certain aspects of the bourgeoisie. And the land-owning class, despite this really colossal power, economic and political, has been absent from the movement. And if it has been in the movement, its contribution has been largely negative. For instance, before 1979, before 1962 more specifically, it was always mainstay of the monarchist power in Kurdistan. They were landowners, were part of the political structure, part of the economic structure, and so on. Aside from that, is that tribalism in Iranian Kurdistan was politically an insignificant factor, unlike Iraqi Kurdistan. So in Iraqi Kurdistan, we see that land-owning class and tribalism predominate the movement. And the urban middle classes and the urban intelligentsia are active in the movement, but they're under the leadership of the tribal. In large, this is similarly in Turkey, we see that even now that we are in 21st century, we see that a land-owning class in northern Kurdistan, the Aghas, are a powerful factor in politics, and they are most of them are directly related to the power and order, to the AKP, before that to JAPA and various so on. So they were not on the side of you. In that respect, this similarity with Iraqi Kurdistan in this respect, with Iranian Kurdistan, we see that, But in Iran, two important factors came about, and those of them related to the working of power in Iran. One is that the first Pahlavi, Reza Shah, basically, in order to establish the state in Iran, a centralized state in Iran, it went through a massive politics of territorial centralization. The territorial centralization of Reza Shah largely broke down the political organization of the tribes, Kurdish tribes included. It's not just Kurdish tribes, but they were Qashqais, they were, Bakhtiaris, they were other, including also, they were Azeri tribes, they were, but their political organization were, if you like, destroyed. If not destroyed, severely undermined. They were disarmed and so on and so forth. The second important act which came about in 1962 was the land reform in Iran. Land reform broke down the economic structure of land ownership, of tribal and non-tribal. So in a sense, inadvertently, the Iranian state made it possible for the urban classes to predominate the movement, and the marginalized tribes from national, and more or less actually pushed them out, or even after the revolution, when the Islamic State tried to revive the tribes against the Kurdish nationalist forces. This policy did not work, largely because land reform had taken effect. The peasants, most of them were now farmers. They had their plots, although may not be sufficient, but they were not really happy to go back to the old order. And landlords could not force, could not push, because they had to fight in two, if you like, fronts, against the peasants and farmers and against the nationalist forces. This could have. Now lately the situation has changed. I mean, they have been introduced what is called the Islamic Peshmergas and so on. This is quite a different issue, which has, in a sense, the Islamic regime has tried to do a partial retribalization of Kurdish politics, and certain aspects has been successful, but not in all parts. So this is, in relation to that, with Turkey, I mean, we see that is still in Turkey, this land reform is still is wanted. It's not happening. But in Iraq, traditionally, we see that, for instance, this is very obvious now, that tribal structure is now interwoven with oil revenue, with oil rent, and oil rent and tribal structure are predominating the political space.
Well, thank you for that. So I'm going to move to some of the questions here. I have a question here from Bruce Chellick, and it is, thank you so very much for this talk, Professor Vali. I was wondering if he could elaborate more on the linkages between the dissolution of pre-capitalist relations and the circularity of violence, perhaps with a historical evolution of this linkage after the 1960s.
Yes, it is very important in a sense after 1960. I think for 3 years, the regime in Iran was about to move and, if you like, enjoy the fruits of those reforms. But then the course was diverted in a sense, and we see a difference between the first phase of reform, second phase of reform, and the third phase of reform. The first phase is quite radical, second phase is less radical, third phase is very conservative. They're trying to, if you like, maintain some sort of, if you like, all the structures and relations in the countryside, largely because of fear of radicalism in the countryside, because of the threat of Maoism, peasant movements, and so on and so forth. This is very important, as I have mentioned in the book as well. And this is, of course, in relation to a kind of research that late Professor Hassanpour conducted in Iran in relation to peasant movements in Iran. This is, Kurdistan is really very significant in this respect, and it shows the significance of pre-capitalist relations in Iran, exorbitant, in Kurdistan, exorbitant rents, insecure tenancy, if you like, massive landlessness, and so on and so forth. That this is a spot that in Iran, it's in that we see in 1951, 51, 52, in the Mukriam Basin in Iran, we see a peasant movement, which is developing rather fast, taking over a significant area. And if you like, peasants are joining, fighting against, the government is bringing forces, bringing the army, gendarmerie, and so on. With the help of the landlords, eventually it is put down after some 18 months. And the leader of it escapes to Iraqi Kurdistan, and the movement is crushed. But what I'm really here in referring to is that aside from Amir Hassanpour and myself, seldom you see that Iranian historians and political scientists, sociologists have ever referred to. In fact, what I was coming to is that if you see that there's I think it was in the 1970s, mid 70s or mid to late 70s, I think, that Professor Abrahamian, the distinguished historian of Iran, and a colleague of him from the University of New York, whose name just escapes me now, and they wrote an article, and his article, they were trying very hard to explain why there are no peasant movements in Iran. You see, this shows a fundamentally Persian ethos of modern Kurdish, modern Iranian historiography. Iran is the Persian-speaking Iran. Iran is the Persian hinterland, Isfahan, Shiraz, Tehran, Mashhad, and so on. So what happens in Kurdistan is never considered. So when you say that, no, you are really wrong, that this is absurd to say that there were no peasant movements in Iran, it's only because you're looking at Iran in a very specific way. And there were peasant movements, and this peasant movement basically shows the strength and brutality of those pre-capitalist relations in Kurdistan. And it is important to say that in the genealogy of violence, it would be impossible not to consider these pre-capitalist relations in Iranian Kurdistan as a network, as a filter through which the relationship between sovereign power and Kurdish opposition passes and articulates. In a sense, what I call the dialectical nexus of violence is grounded until 1962 in these pre-capitalist relations. And after 1962, with a lull of 3-4 years, after that, it is in the articulation of political violence and oil rent. And this is so the structure of economic structure of violence, which provides, in which the relations of violence are grounded, changes from pre-capitalist to capitalist, but this is a specific form of capitalism because after what we have until 1953 is what I call absolutism. 1953 to 1962, we have a redeployed form of absolutism. After 1953, we move towards what I call royal dictatorship. Royal dictatorship is based on military security and oil revenue. And this is, at the apex of it is the Shah, is the court, and so on. So up to 1962, I would say any study of political violence in Iran would be impossible without considering the powerful network of pre-capitalist relations in Iran.
Okay, so we have a next question here from Lalu Abdi. My question for Dr. Abbas Vali, you mentioned the transition of the center of Kurdish nationalism from the Mahabad area to the Sanandaj-Kermanshah area. What role does Kurdish language play in the success of Kurdish nationalist movement? Sorry, so scroll down a bit. For the foreseeable future, and in an area like Kermanshah, for example, where we are seeing Farsi being increasingly used instead of native Kurdish, can the movement be damaged, or is the nationalist movement strengthened by the Kurdish language along with other aspects of Kurdish identity?
Well, there is a transition, so to speak. There is a shift. I wouldn't say transition. There is a shift in the locus of political radicalism, not just nationalism, political radicalism, from north to the south. For instance, if you look at radical Kurdish feminist writings in the last 20 years, about 90, I would say 90% of it, if I'm not wrong, probably even more, coming from women from southern Kurdistan. And similarly, after the revolution, I see that now most of the more or less, I would say, journals which are, which have, because of the, censorship and suppression in Iran, I am talking hesitantly, I would say that they have, or they try to have a radical outlook, in Iran, sometimes successfully, sometimes, they try, but not easy, unsuccessfully. But if you look at that, most of it is from Sanandaj, Mariwan, that area. and even Kermanshah. When about 18 months ago, there was a journal in based in Kermanshah. It was called Gilvan. Gilvan conducted a very long interview with me, about 10 hours. In different, it was recorded in 10 hours. But then the final interview, which was done, and I sent the recorded interview to them, the Gilvan was suppressed. It was, and the editorial board were arrested and put in prison. And obviously my interviews all went to the security. And I don't know what they're doing with 10 hours of, talking about politics, but this is how it was. But, it shows that, for instance, Kermanshah, despite what you say, is that there is a concerted attempt by the government and related forces to propagate and encourage Persian speaking there. But this doesn't seem to have dampened or undermined the desire or zest to sustain and develop Kurdish identity. In a sense, I think this kind of, if the intelligentsia there and the people, political activists, potential or actual university students with orientation towards politics and so on and so forth, are aware that this kind of policy is being systematically pursued by the government and related agencies, you have to be sure that this is not going to stick. This is not going to be successful. But in fact, factors which have happened, important factors such as the earthquake, such as unemployment, such as very catastrophic critical economic financial conditions, drastic sort of a situation of drug addiction and so on and so forth, have seriously radicalized that sector of Kurdistan. Now, it may be that immediately the orientation of this radicalism is not towards what conventionally known as Kurdish nationalism, but it is seriously anti-status quo, anti-regime, and anti-development. In fact, even the government's move towards radicalization of Shi'i sectors of Kurdish community in Iran only was successful for a few years after the revolution. That has also, in a sense, lost its significance. One thing is important to be paid attention to here. As we know that Kurdish identity, in a sense, is a response. It is a kind to the dominant sovereign identity in Iran. Changes in the constituent elements of that sovereign identity and reflected, can reflect and then does reflect in the structure of Kurdish identity in that respect. For instance, unlike the monarchist time, this regime, it does have have a conception of identity defined by Persian language, Persian culture, history, ethnicity, and Twelver Shi'ism. But in the order that it is organized and pursued in the discourse, official discourse, the Shi'i element, the religious element, is superior over ethnicity and language. And in this respect, they're trying to push that in Kurdistan as well by radicalizing in the wrong direction Sunni political activity, in a sense. And this we can see that in certain ways happening, but in the wrong direction. For instance, we saw that when the Majlis in Iran was attacked, the attackers, apparently 5 of them, all of them, or 3, 4 out of 5 of them, were for Kurds from Kurdistan, and they came from an area traditionally, if you like, predominated by Dervishi, Sufi tariqats. Clearly, this change, in the identity has been important. And we see, for instance, in the rise of Kurdish Salafism in Kurdistan, which is becoming a problem, there is very little doubt that the government strategy and government forces are behind it. So in a sense, I would say that what is happening in Kermanshah, and there is a, if you like, move towards more, if you like, use of Persian language and turning away from Kurdish language, I would only see it as a temporary phenomenon and politically in the long run insignificant if it is known to the people that this is part of a planned strategy.
Okay, so the next question I have is from Peyman Haydaran. Thank you very much for your thoughtful talk. What is your opinion about the overlaps between Kurdish nationalism and Iranian nationalism in comparison with Turkish nationalism in Turkey and, say, for example, Turkmen or Uzbek nationalism? I think this is a question about Kurdish nationalism and pan-Iranianism, Iranian nationalism and its relationship to that concept.
Well, Iranian nationalism here, by which I understand a discourse which pursues the idea of a unitary Iran with unitary language, with unitary, if you like, culture and history. And this is all united under, one banner, which is banner of Persianism, so to speak, Iranianism. If that is the case, I think there will be very little ground for overlapping with Kurdish nationalism. But if it opens up in a way that they always do, that they say that the Kurds are, if you like, they go into certain, what I would call really kind of racist discourse, that we are all Aryans. And the Kurds and Persians are Aryans. We are not Turks, we are not Arabs, but we are Aryans. So they established this kind of racist linkage, so racial linkage with the Kurds. But at the same time, when they say that, they also say that the Kurdish language is not really a language. It is only a dialect, and in fact, a more underdeveloped dialect of Persian, and that Kurdish culture is a variant, again, more tribal, more, if you like, rural variant of Persian, the high Persian culture, so to speak. If that is the element for overlap and unity, I would say that it will have very little political purchase. Unless we are talking about, if political organizations like the old Pan-Iranist, party, which under monarchy was arguing for unity of all Persian, which also included Tajiks and, parts of Afghanistan, parts of India, parts of, if you looked at its map, it was frightfully sort of continent, was a whole, Persia was more than an empire. But there is no ground for that. I would say that overlapping may happen at present on the cultural level between elements of Kurdish middle classes and Persian middle classes, but mostly in the Kurdish diaspora in Tehran, Karaj, and around that area. There is no doubt that among the people, ordinary people, this culture overlap, particularly in the field of music and poetry, does exist. But whether or not it can be politicized by the Iranian nationalists, so to speak, and so strongly and thoroughly as to make a political capital out of it, I seriously doubt it. I seriously doubt it. I think this kind of the great Iran, that the Kurds part of it, the, if you like, brave protector of our borders, our cultures, people, the salt of the earth, they are coming from rural background and mountains and so on and so forth. I think among the political sectors of Kurdish community, nobody buys this narrative. And it may appear to sort of certain elements of Kurdish middle class who have grown up or lived for a long time in Tehran and other parts. But I would hesitate to say that it would be easy for the government or the related forces try to make a political capital out of it.
So, we're running low on time at the moment, so I probably only have time for maybe two more questions. I have a question here from Ambassador Siaman Bana. Most of the Kurdish intellectuals from the Republic migrated to Iraq and Syria after the collapse, and their interaction with nationalists and Marxists in both countries until the coup d'etat of 1958 and the return of Barzani from the Soviet Union, when Iranian Kurdish nationalists were weaned away from the influence of the Tudeh party towards the basic version of nationalism. Until 1970, Iranian Kurdish nationalists helped and were in the main with the Iraqi Kurdish uprising. KDPI remained an appendage of the Tudeh until 1979. My question, when did the main thrust of Kurdish national movement in Iran take an independent course from the Iraqi Kurdish movement?
I think this is a complicated, question to answer, largely because it takes a lot to answer it. It is true that Iranian Kurdish movement, when you put it like that, before 1979, was under two very different influences. One was the Communist Party of Iran, and the other one was the Iraqi KDP, primarily the late Barzani and his faction within his, if you like, grouping within the KDP, and subsequently when it dominated the KDP, the whole KDP. Iranian, Kurdish movement, as I have also explained in this grouping, was in this book, was never uniform. Both tendencies did exist in the Iranian Kurdish movement, right more or less from the beginning, or at least after 19 1953 coup d'etat in Iran. When, for instance, when the republic collapsed, part of the Kurdish nationalists in Iran migrated to Soviet Union. They escaped, they fled to Soviet Union. And some also were there, had been sent to study there. But they were there. And then the late Barzani, of course, appeared in there. They were all in Baku, around that area. And this factionalism, you can see that even in Baku there. On the one hand, they are the left-wingers like Rahim Qazi, like others, that they subsequently became important people, figures within the KDP, and they're opposed to Barzani and Barzani's influence within the KDPI. And the first initiative to revive the Kurdish movement in exile in the late 1940s and early 50s does actually come from that Barzani initiative. But this initiative is not successful because fundamentally because Ali Gelawish, all the other left-wing Kurds there are opposed to it. This tendency continues. We see after 1953 again that the Tudeh party is dominant intellectual influence in the KDP, but there is the ethnicist nationalists there represented by Ahmed Tawfiq, who's it's kind of the political, sort of the name for Abdullah Ishaqi, a Kurd from Mahabad. But we see that the struggle between the left and the ethnic nationalist, which is represented by Ishaqi's, by Ahmed Tawfiq's faction, is present in the party. After party goes to exile in 1959, when Barzani has come back and is already in Kurdistan, Barzani tries to support the ethnic nationalist faction of Ishaqi, Ahmed Tawfiq. And subsequently in 1962, conflict within the party is very strong. In the second Congress of the KDP of Iran, Ahmed Tawfiq expels the left from the party. Qasimlu and several others were expelled from the party. And they establish a powerful opposition to the party, outside party, mostly in the Eastern Bloc. But when the situation in the Middle East, larger political picture changes, Qasimlu and the leadership comes back to Iraq in cooperation with the central government, and the conflict within the party has been renewed again within the KDPI. Eventually, just before the takeover of the party by the left, Ahmed Tawfiq himself has been abandoned by Barzani, and he dies or was killed in very suspicious circumstances in Baghdad. Many say by Barzani's order, many say by the order of the Abbas, and of course we do not know, but maybe somewhere in between the truth lies. But the left predominates in the party. But after 1975 onwards, the predominance of the left is also tantamount with, it goes hand in hand with an attempt to the de-Tudification, to remove, or at least marginalize or reduce the influence of the Tuda within the KDP. Tuda is only in 1965 that actually comes and accepts the doctrine of national rights, national self-determination. It was a communist party that up to 1965 had not accepted that. But anyway, we see after 1973, the Third Congress, when Qasimlu and the friends take over just before the revolution, the conflict within the KDP with the Tute starts and it expands. After the revolution, it becomes the primary conflict. And in the Fourth Congress in 1980, we see that 7 people depart from the leadership of the party over the major policy issue that they believed that in line with Tuda's strategy, the party, the KDPI, must support Khomeini and his regime on the grounds that it represents anti-imperialism and anti-imperialist forces in Iran, struggle against American imperialism and its European partners. But this line in party is defeated, and those 7 people, including Hemen, who was the important Kurdish poet, were part of one of these 7. They were expelled from the party, and the party became more or less largely, I would say, not say completely, under the sway of the left, represented by and led by Qasimlu. This situation continued up to Qasimlu's death, and even today. The idea of the left predominance in the party has always been, if you like, mixed with the struggle against Tuda and Tuda influence, although I would say that ethnic nationalism has made a comeback within the KDP, but in a very different form. It is also inclined towards the Kurdish forces in Iraq, but in a very different form. Now, after the revolution, particularly after 1983, the military defeat, when the military defeat of the Kurdish movement became increasingly evident in Iran, and the Kurdish forces, whether it was the communist forces, whether Kurdish left-wing Maoist or other forces, or whether the KDPI moved to Iraqi Kurdistan, their relationship there was with the Abbas regime. But with the establishment of the safe haven in 1992, where 1991-92, we see that they establish a working relationship both with the KDP and with the PUK. Komala and its various branches in the green zone with the PUK, KDPI, which is now split into 2 sections, with the KDP Iraq. This relationship continues there. This is a relationship of understanding between them, that they will reside there, they will have their bases there, their Peshmergas there, but provided that they will not carry out military activity, military action from Iraqi Kurdistan against the Iranian government. This is the understanding between them, mostly kept. At times it has been overlooked, but never in a significant way.
Okay, well, it seems we are out of time for today, but this has been a very fruitful discussion. I want to thank Professor Vali for giving such an excellent talk and giving really expansive and detailed answers to the questions that people asked. I'm sorry that we're not able to get to all the questions, but we only have limited time here. Yeah, and I'd also like to thank Cengiz and the Center for Kurdish Progress for setting up this wonderful event, and thank all of you for attending and all of your wonderful questions. It's very much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.